winter owl hooted, and in this cold air his breath made white steam in the air. He was a boy with grey curly short hair and round brown eyes. I loved the way that he would smile at you, even if you were a stranger. His thin lips were always happy. Now, here he was on this winter's night as a winter owl hooted. He felt as if he'd been quite warm inside of his clothes, but that was because he'd just been in a bath. This was a boy who loved to tap dance. He was helpful and generous, and he had lots of friends, and he would play with his friends in the big park. But while he'd been inside of the bath, he'd heard the mooing of two calves. Two calves that had wandered away from the rest of the herd, for he lived on a farm. And he was going to go, and try and win a trophy at the tap dancing competition. He'd had to jump out of the bath. He'd put on his long-sleeved spotty shirt. He wasn't a boy who was really made for working on a farm. He was quite thin, to be honest. His hands were little and weak. But when he'd heard those two calves mooing, and he had fed them so many times before, he couldn't stop himself. From out of the warmth of the bath he jumped up, pulled on his scruffy ripped jeans, pulled on his best spotty shirt that he was going to try and win a trophy at the tap dancing competition in, and pulled on his wellies. But when it is winter, it's very muddy, and it didn't take very long for his wellies to get very muddy indeed. He might not have been made for working on a farm with strong shoulders and arms, but he was very good at swimming and dancing. And he didn't mind if the water inside of the swimming pool was cold. But the air seemed to be very cold tonight, and he didn't know whether it was just because he'd jumped out of a red-hot bath, but he needed to look after these two orphan calves. They'd lost their mother and their father. He'd taken a baby bottle, and he'd filled it with thick, rich, creamy milk, and he tried to follow the way that they were mooing. It sounded pitiful and helpless, the way that they were making the noises. But perhaps it's because he'd done so much work with them that he could recognise their mooing. He wasn't taking much notice of the path. So what did he do? He found himself lost. But he didn't care. He'd found the calves, and somehow he would be able to get back to the house. They sucked and they pulled at that thick, warm, rich, creamy milk, but he had no idea how he was going to get back. As he listened, he could hear the other cows in the herd mooing deep and low. So he followed that sound. It's very difficult to get two young calves to walk in a straight line. But eventually he did get back home, and his own mother and father were looking at him with thick muddy wellies on his feet, scruffy ripped jeans and his best tap dancing shirt covered in mud. When he got back, he got himself dressed, and he did go to the tap dancing competition. But he was so tired from having to jump out of the bath, from having to find the calves, to feed the calves, to find his way back in the darkness and the shadow of the night, that he was very tired. He didn't win, but he didn't mind. He'd had such an adventure that night, such an adventure looking after two calves, and that made him feel really good. You would think that he was an old man because his hair was grey. It was curly and short, but perhaps that was just because he was like his dad. His dad's hair was white. But there was something about the way that he smiled, a thin, red-lipped smile that would make you feel happy. And if you looked into his round brown eyes, That would make you feel happy too. He was wearing a very strange combination. A long-sleeved spotty shirt that looked as if it was very good and very expensive, but scruffy ripped jeans and big muddy wellies. It was hard to tell what he was going to do. He wasn't a strong boy, you could see that underneath the shirt, and his hands were small and weak. But he looked like he was a good boy, and I'll tell you something. I'd seen him a couple of times. He would grow vegetables, and he loved the vegetables. He liked to cook them himself. And even though he was wearing welly boots, the thing that he was really good at was tap dancing. You would see him with all of his other friends in the big park, playing, and he would always be helpful and generous with his time. He could swim. Not many of his friends would go swimming with him because they said that the cold swimming pool water was too cold to swim in. But he didn't mind. I would like to have him as my friend, because even though he's thin and he looks as if he's not very strong, he looks as if he could teach me a lot of things. Not just how to swim, but he could show me how to dance. I think as well, he's very kind and generous. Kind and generous with animals, and kind and generous with his friends. And I like that in people, when they're kind and generous to you as well. He's a bit like me. I don't always watch too carefully what it is that I wear. He looks a bit strange with wellies and jeans and spotty shirts, but he still looks as if he's good fun, and I like that in my friend.